What's up, guys? It's Tony here. Welcome to another episode of China Update. I hope you guys are doing well. Of course, most of you guys should know that I've been on holiday for about a week. I've just gotten back. I spent the last week in the French concession area in Shanghai, trying to escape from this crazy world that seems to be on fire every time you check the New York Times or one of these big Western liberal publications. So I've been trying to hide away from all of that craziness and just relax. It has been lovely. I'm back now at work. I'm starting back up tomorrow here in China. It looks like I may or may not be able to put up a special episode this week, a regular episode this week. It'll either go up tomorrow or early next week. There are several hundred articles that I need to review in the next 24 hours if I'm able to put one up. So it's still up in the air whether I can put one up this week. What I wanted to discuss this week was the publication of Pew Research Center's latest survey on public sentiment towards the People's Republic of China. Pew's latest figures, its latest surveys show a complete collapse across the board in sentiment towards China. Public opinion towards China is the most negative in most of these countries surveyed in the history of the survey, which is almost 2 decades long at this point. So I wanted to take this opportunity to dive into the report and look at some of the data and discuss it with you guys and share my views on some of the more interesting points. I also wanted to respond to a narrative that I'm seeing a lot in Western media, or at least Anglophone media at the moment, even in publications like the New York Times. This narrative is that this collapse in opinion, this collapse in public opinion, this rise in negative or unfavorability in all of these advanced economies this year towards China is either largely or fully in part due to the international COVID/pandemic emergency. Now, while it could well be and is likely possible that there has been an increase in the number of negative views towards China in these countries surveyed, it could well be that this is connected to the current state of affairs with COVID. But the report that was released by Pew itself does not actually make this conclusion. This is a conclusion that journalists are making that is not necessarily proven in the document. We also have to remember that since the survey was conducted in late 2019, China, the People's Republic of China, has engaged in a series or a set of state behaviors or policies or made certain statements that are not related to COVID, which are equally likely to contribute to an increase in negative views in these advanced economies. Just to name a few, we've already got the issue with COVID, but there is also the aggressive state and diplomatic response initially at the beginning of the year to try and change or mold narratives or public opinion towards China's handling of the COVID situation in their own country. This sort of behavior has been unpopular in Europe particularly. We've also seen over the last half year to 12 months increased media scrutiny of the situation in Xinjiang province in Western China. We've also seen the passing of the national security law in Hong Kong, for example, which is also not being particularly popular. We've seen increased aggressive or assertive, if you want to be more charitable, behavior in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and particularly on the Sino-Indian border. We've seen collapses in the diplomatic relations between countries like China and the United States, China and Canada, and China and Australia. In fact, Australia has seen the largest deterioration in public opinion towards China based on these poll results, a 24% increase in unfavorable views towards China. Also, as you will see when we look at the data shortly, there is a large percentage of those surveyed who believe that China handled the pandemic well that still maintain an unfavorable view towards China, suggesting that the pandemic is not the primary reason for this increase in unfavorable views towards the PRC. So it's worth, I think, looking at exactly what the data says and some interesting points that I think we should take away from this. So this is what today's episode is basically just going to be about, looking at this breakdown. If you enjoy the episode, don't forget to smash that like button, and as always, I always appreciate your thoughts and comments below, and if you want to be a supporter on Patreon, that link is below as well. Okay, first up, let's look at a basic country breakdown. This is, I think, some of the most important macro data we're dealing with here. The percentage who have a favorable or an unfavorable view of China. And as you can see across the board, as the title of this research report indicates, the title is Unfavorable Views of China Reach Historic Highs in Many Countries. We can see this jump in unfavorable views, negative views towards China across these developed nations, not just in the West, but also in East Asia, with South Korea and Japan included here. We can see that there is a trend with most of these countries. You see this jump beginning in 2017, 2018, 2019, and then a big jump into 2020. Let's look first at Australia there in the corner. Now, this is something that I think is particularly sad. This is a particularly sad development. If you look at Australia here and you compare it to the other countries and their history over the last almost 2 decades, Australia is one of the few countries that has maintained through most of the last 2 decades, based on the survey data at least, a net positive view towards China. China and Australia had tremendous potential to build a healthy bilateral relationship, and politicians who wanted to push that in Australia had the advantage of net favorability rates towards China. And look, none of these other countries, with the exception of the UK, which we'll touch on in a moment, have that same long-term sustained favorability. And then we've seen in the last 3 years a complete collapse in that goodwill and that favorability. It's dropped to 15%. Unfavorability is up through the roof. Those of you who've been watching me for a while know that there has been a diplomatic dispute between China and Australia. Some people would argue that Australia, especially those who believe the state-run media narrative coming out of the PRC, that Australia made moves in the last few years that damaged the relationship and has sent it to this point, to the the China-Australia relationship. I would disagree. I've been following the relationship very closely for at least 4 years now, and I would argue that on balance, China has made more mistakes in the relationship, and the reason that the relationship is so poor now has primarily been because of actions and words coming out of Beijing, less so out of Canberra in Australia. So this is quite disappointing. It's sad. It is a wasted opportunity for a very healthy bilateral relationship that has probably been damaged for a generation here. We can also see with the UK, which is also potentially moving into a Canada/Australia level diplomatic dispute with Beijing, has also, through most of this time, had a net positive view of China, and we've only seen that change in the last 2 or 3 years with a collapse in sentiment towards China. With the other countries, let's look: Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, the US, South Korea, Spain. All they have their different trajectories there, but they've all seen dramatic increases in negative evaluations of China over the last few years. US, of course, is particularly important because of its power on the world stage and its influence and size of its market. We can see Canada, again, another Anglophone nation, where for the first decade of this century, it was net positive, and it has only really been in the last 2 or 3 years that there has been a massive drop or deterioration in views towards the PRC. Interestingly there, Italy has always had net negative views, and Japan, well, Japan and China have a very complicated relationship. Japan has had worse, its unfavorable, its percentage of the population that has unfavorable views towards China based on this data, the research from Pew Research Center, was at its highest about 2012, 2013, which I believe was around the time where there were massive anti-Japanese protests in China. Then there has been a slow thawing in the relationships, getting slightly better, and then about 4 years ago it turned around and is now at very high levels of 86% negative views. Okay, let's look at these over time with a bit more detail. We can see here, again, this illustrates what we could see in the last set of graphs. We can see that for most of these countries, the unfavorable views towards China were at their lowest point early on, almost 2 decades ago, with the exception of Italy and, of course, Australia. You can see it was as late as 2017 that unfavorable levels were at their lowest towards the PRC. So again, potentially a wasted opportunity there for a healthy bilateral relationship. Next up, while we're on this theme, while we're looking at the countries, it's also worth looking, I think, at the evaluation of the leader Xi Jinping. So this here is a map. This is not looking at the country, views towards the country, but views towards confidence in the leader Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping, by country. So this is more a direct question about the political system, the political leadership, and the confidence in that leadership from different countries, people in different countries. And we can see a similar trend across the board. There has been an increase, with the exception of Japan, which has basically maintained no confidence throughout most of the time that the survey has been done. We can see we can see in the case of places like Australia and South Korea dramatic reductions in confidence in Xi Jinping to do the quote right thing regarding world affairs. And with all the other countries, the majority have no confidence, and then it is increased over time. Okay, next graph. This one I think is very interesting. This is from Pew Research. It says older people often see China more negatively, and we can see here, with the exception of some players down the bottom, which we're going to touch on shortly, we can see that there really is a larger percent of those who are older that have unfavorable views of China based from all these countries. But what's interesting is, depending on the group, whether it's 50 plus or 18 to 29, every single country that was surveyed, the people in every single country that was surveyed in this survey, in every country, the majority of peoples in every age group, the majority have unfavorable views. And even though we can see, say, in like the US and Canada and the UK, over 80% of the 50 pluses that were interviewed have negative views, whereas the younger cohort, it's only about 50 to 60%. These are still majority populations. Now, what's interesting is, if we look down the bottom, there's a bit of an exception here with Japan, and in particular South Korea. South Korea, the younger cohorts, including the 18 to 29-year-old cohorts, have much higher unfavorability rates than the older cohort. Now, this is particularly interesting, and to Japan, it's sort of like that, but to a much lesser extent. What is interesting is that South Korea and Japan are very important East Asian players. Japan, if you take the US out of the picture and look at the balance of power in East Asia, the two big players are, of course, China and Japan. South Korea sits in a particularly important geopolitical position on the Korean Peninsula, often called a knife at China's neck because of its place, and is often a springboard for military action, whether it's China against Japan or Japan against China. South Korea is a very important player, geopolitically speaking, in that region, as is Taiwan, as an entity as well. So the fact that you're seeing here that in Korea and to a lesser extent Japan, the next generation of policymakers, the next generation of journalists, the next generation of voters have higher unfavorability rates than the older generations, I think is very telling, and it could be signaling that there is going to be policies in the future that are going to be more concerned with China and are going to be more accommodating of a security relationship with an external guarantor like the US. They're going to be more favorable towards a security guarantor than the massive market that China offers than perhaps we've seen in the past, because of this younger generation that is more concerned than the older generation. The last thing I wanted to look at quickly was also this breakdown, which I find particularly interesting. Now, this breakdown looks at per country the percentage who have an unfavorable view of China among those who say China has done a good or a bad job dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. Now, I find this particularly interesting, and it's worth touching on here. And this is what I think in particular undermines this narrative that we're seeing in media, some media outlets, that this massive increase in unfavorability rates is due primarily to the global pandemic. What's interesting here is that with the exception of Italy and Spain, in every single country, those who are surveyed, of those who think China did a good job at handling the global pandemic, in all of these cases except Italy and Spain, the majority of those people who thought China did a good job still have unfavorable views of China. For those of you who are still with me, I'm glad that we took the time to look at this data. I think this sort of research is particularly important because it shows a general trend across the board in the developed world, not just in the West, but also in East Asia, of increasing concern about Beijing. Now, while public opinion does not always dictate public policy, particularly foreign policy, which has often been the domain of the elite, this sort of massive increase in unpopularity or this increase in unfavorability gives a lot of political wiggle room and scope to politicians that may want to push domestically a harder message towards China or a harsher policy towards China or China policy. And we need to think about this going forward as we see more and more countries, either in the political realm or in the policy realm within the government, changing their views on China. We're probably going to see friction between business communities, particularly in places like Germany, for example, and the political sphere, where politicians and policymakers are responding to the signal coming from their electorate that they want a tougher stance on China. It's also going to be interesting to see how Beijing responds to this, whether they're going to double down on their formula so far, which is so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, this assertive or aggressive diplomatic posturing and messaging, whether they're going to double down on this very aggressive or assertive state media narrative overseas and on Western or international social media platforms, or whether they're going to change up their approach to trying to win hearts and minds, as it were, in the developed world. But that's basically the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe and stay sane wherever you are, and I will see you next time on China Update.